December 1937 marked one of history's darkest chapters, the Nanking Massacre. Over 6 weeks, the Imperial Japanese Army unleashed a wave of brutality upon China's then capital, Nanking. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were slaughtered, and countless women were subjected to horrific sexual violence. This harrowing event stands as a chilling reminder of the depths of human cruelty during times of war. Join us as we uncover the heartbreaking truths of the Nanking Massacre, a dark and somber chapter etched into the pages of human suffering. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which set the stage for the Nanking Massacre, was rooted in decades of escalating tensions between China and Japan. Japan, seeking to expand its influence and resources, had already seized control of Korea and Taiwan by the early 20th century. The 1931 invasion of Manchuria marked a turning point, as Japan established a military presence in mainland China. In 1937, a full-scale war erupted as Japan aimed to dominate China's key cities, crippling resistance and securing resources. However, Chinese forces, including the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces of Mao Zedong, led a difficult resistance against them. The fall of Shanghai in late 1937 signaled Japan's growing dominance as the Imperial Army targeted Nanking, China's capital at the time. Despite desperate efforts by Chinese troops, the city was unprepared for the ferocity of Japan's advance. This backdrop of imperial ambition and wartime desperation laid the foundation for the horrors that would unfold in Nanking, making the massacre not just an isolated tragedy, but a grim culmination of years of bloody conflict. The Japanese army advanced swiftly towards Nanking. By early December 1937, they reached the city's outskirts, surrounding it and overwhelming its defenses. Nanking's gates were breached shortly thereafter, on the 13th of December, with Japanese forces swiftly taking control of the city and initiating a period of widespread violence. In the lead-up to World War II, the Japanese believed that they were destined to rule over all of Asia due to their intellectual, martial, and genetic superiority. The Chinese bore the brunt of this belief, as they were considered to be the lowest of the low, with one participant of the Nanking Massacre saying, "We were taught that we were a superior race, but the Chinese were not, so we held nothing but contempt for them. There were many rapes, and the women were always killed. When they were being raped, the women were human. But once the rape was finished, they became pig's flesh." The Japanese army entered the city on the 13th of December, with the massacre beginning almost immediately. Japanese officers made no effort to control their men, who were allowed total free rein to brutalize both Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. The violence began with mopping up operations, trying to locate and kill all remaining Chinese soldiers. Many innocent civilians were accused of being soldiers and were tortured and killed without any trial or investigation. Once all military resistance had been crushed, what followed was 6 weeks of slaughter and rape. Over the course of the occupation, over 300,000 were killed, and anywhere from 20 to 80,000 women were raped. No one was spared, not even the elderly or very young. Japanese officers directly encouraged the violence, which was used as a means to break the will of the Chinese people, to keep them from challenging the new Japanese occupation. The massacre lasted 6 weeks. Only 2 days after the violence began, American Christian missionary Minnie Vautrin, who was at the time working at a school in Nanking, wrote, "The Japanese have looted widely yesterday and today, have destroyed schools, have killed citizens, and raped women. 1,000 disarmed Chinese soldiers, whom the International Committee hoped to save, were taken from them and by this time are probably shot or bayoneted." No one in Nanking was safe, and death could come at any time. Men and women were shot in the streets for no reason, and homes were broken into as Japanese soldiers searched for money, valuables, and women. There was no limit to the brutality of the soldiers, with even the most depraved acts of violence being allowed by their commanders and fellow soldiers. The bodies of the victims were buried in the 10,000 corpse ditch. Then, only a young boy, Chen Guangsheng, lived in a small village immediately outside of Nanking. His entire family, his entire village, everyone he knew in life was massacred, mowed down with machine guns. He survived because of his one act of kindness, giving a Japanese soldier 2 chickens and a small bag of potatoes. The Japanese military abhorred the Chinese and believed surrender was the sign of a coward, meaning Chinese POWs were afforded absolutely no rights, with many being killed on a whim by bloodthirsty Japanese soldiers. Executions were carried out en masse with machine guns or by dousing the victims in petrol and setting them alight. The bodies were either burned in large heaps, buried in mass graves, or thrown into the Yangtze River. Foreign journalists in Nanking leaked information to the outside world, ensuring the atrocities were reported on. In order to encourage remaining soldiers to surrender, the Japanese forces declared an amnesty for all who willingly laid down their weapons and turned themselves in. The Japanese promised that those who gave themselves up would be treated fairly and left unharmed. The amnesty was nothing but a ruse to trick Chinese soldiers into surrendering. In one instance, a group of 200 soldiers surrendered but were murdered instantly. The killings led to less soldiers handing themselves in, and in response, the Japanese soldiers began to round up large groups of suspicious men who were accused of being soldiers and executed. In one instance, 400 men were taken as prisoners of war, despite there being no evidence that they were soldiers. They were tied together in groups of 50 and taken away one by one. Within 10 minutes, all 400 were dead, having been executed by rifle and machine gun fire. The women of Nanking were especially vulnerable, and the attacks on them were beyond sadistic. Women and girls were raped with broken glass and bayonets, and pregnant women had their unborn children cut from their stomachs and shot, stabbed, or beaten. The Japanese soldiers spent much of their time searching for unwilling women to attack. Edgar Snow, an American journalist in Nanking, said of the massacre, "Frequently, mothers had to watch their babies beheaded and then submit to raping." The women were usually executed after the ordeal, but a number were allowed to live, kept as sex slaves in Japanese barracks, where hundreds of Japanese soldiers took advantage of them, suffering multiple rapes every single day. Young girls did all they could to make themselves unappealing to the invaders, such as dressing in boys' clothes and shaving their hair. Ren Wen-ying was one of the young girls to hide their gender, living as a boy for the duration of the occupation. The Japanese soldiers suspected she was lying and forced her and some other girls in disguise to fight to see if they were really boys or not. Wen-ying was lucky. Her disguise worked and lived to an old age. One of the girl's true gender was discovered, however. She was taken away and never seen again. Sexual violence was not only a way for Japanese soldiers to relieve themselves, it was used as a tool to degrade and humiliate the Chinese people. Some of the most disgusting acts include forcing families to engage in incest while the family watched at gunpoint. Monks who had taken vows of celibacy were forced to have sex or be castrated, and in the worst cases, men were forced to have sex with dead bodies. One victim was Sha Shukin, an 8-year-old girl. On the morning of the 13th of December, a large group of Japanese soldiers forced their way into her home. Her father and another man were shot dead instantly. Her mother had hidden her under a table with her 1-year-old baby. When she was discovered, the child was taken from her. The Japanese soldiers tore off the baby's arms and slammed her on the ground. The mother was then gang raped and stabbed to death, and her 2 elder daughters were murdered. Jia was discovered hiding under the bed and stabbed in the back. She survived and regained consciousness some time later, finding that she and her young sister were the only survivors. Afraid to leave the house, they spent the next 2 weeks living on what remained of some burnt rice alongside the corpses of their family. Many soldiers who took part in the massacre have spoken openly about their experiences. Takokoro Kozo was a willing participant and said of the massacre, "No matter how young or old, they all could not escape the fate of being raped. We sent out coal trucks to the city streets and villages to seize a lot of women, and then each of them was allocated to 15 to 20 soldiers for sexual intercourse and abuse." Some Japanese officers, such as Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, saw the massacre as a chance to test their skills with a sword. They held a competition between themselves to see who would be the first to kill 100 people with their katana. Both officers reached their goal quickly, though they could not decide on a clear winner. They organized a second round, this time aiming for 150 dead. Japanese newspapers reported positively on the story, with one paper, Nichi Nichi, running the headline, "Incredible Record for Beheading 100 People." The two men were depicted as noble samurai, slaying their savage enemy in battle with their katana. Despite how the story was depicted in the Japanese media, the men were not charging into the heat of battle with sword in hand. One paper reported, "When the two second lieutenants captured Jurong City, they rushed to the front and fought bravely. Until the fall of the enemy, the two achieved a close match. Mukai killed 89 and Noda killed 78. This depiction was far from the truth. The majority of their victims were unarmed prisoners of war and civilians, incapable of defending themselves." Noda openly admitted to this later on as he gave a speech in his hometown. "I killed only 4 or 5 with sword in the real combat. After we captured an enemy trench, we'd tell them, 'Ni lai lai.' The Chinese soldiers were stupid enough to come out the trench towards us one after another. We'd line them up and cut them down." Both men were arrested by American occupation forces in 1947 and were then extradited to China to face justice. The men were found guilty and sentenced to death. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo Trial, began soon after the end of World War II in 1946, in which dozens of Japanese war criminals were tried for war crimes. Beginning immediately prior to World War II, in a country not often recognized for its contribution to the Allied war effort, Nanking is little known, having been overshadowed by other atrocities of the war, such as the Holocaust or Japanese abuses against British and American POWs. Despite this, it is one of the most brutal events of the 20th century. The events of that time have not yet been fully relegated to the past, as around 34 survivors still remained as of May 2024. While Germany admitted to its crimes long ago and worked to pay reparations for its actions, many criticized Japan for its failure to acknowledge its criminal actions. Various Japanese politicians since World War II have apologized for the nation's actions, but denial of these crimes is still somewhat common in Japanese society. The government of Japan still pays great respect to the Yasukuni Shrine, which commemorates and houses the ashes of Japanese war dead, including a number of convicted war criminals, as well as a museum that gives a highly censored version of Japan's actions during World War II.